So this is a test tutorial using Touchdesigner Blender. Today I made an interactive moth, and doing this in Touchdesigner, importing geometry from Blender, has a couple challenges that we'll get over in this little video. The first thing I'm doing here is I'm importing my file as an FBX. I use FBXs with Touchdesigner because they can bring in bone animation, materials, models, multiple models. You can have hierarchies, all these different things. But there are some challenges to that. One of them being that every time you bring in an FBX model, every time you re-import it, it refreshes the entire hierarchy. And that's all good until you start modifying things inside of that hierarchy. Things like adding animation or changing materials, all this ends up just getting wiped away. So that can be very frustrating. Another thing that happens is that all the materials that come in are phongs by default. So we're going to get around this a little bit. First here I'm setting up the kind of rendering environment. So I've imported my FBX Moth as with the FBX component. Now I'm creating a camera and I'm zooming it out a little bit. I always create a camera and I connect it to a null. That null is at 0, 0, 0. The moth is at 0, 0, 0. And then I parent the camera to that null so that when you rotate the null itself, you have the camera centered around that center point. That way you never have to think about where the camera's looking or missing the model somehow. I've just dropped in a render node. That render node is rendering the camera, and you can see that the model is black because there is no light in the scene yet. And that's all good. Let's make one. So because I'm intending to use PBR materials, I'm dropping in an environment light. Environment lights only work with PBR materials anyway, so yeah, that's all good. So here we can see inside of the FBX, and it creates a material for every single object there, and a different hierarchy, a different comp for every object as well. So it can get pretty messy. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is going to take a little bit of time, but we only have to do it once and then it really makes things a lot easier, is I'm going to create a script that's going to search through my entire FBX hierarchy, find all my materials, and change them into PBR materials. So here I'm using an opfind, which is a DAT that creates a table with all of the operators that are in a certain area or a certain place. So I created the opfind, I pointed it at the Moth FBX, and now I'm creating a little text DAT on the side with a script, and in this script I am going to make a for loop that loops through each of the objects in the table, finds those materials, and changes them. So I don't know if you saw just before with the opfind, I switched it to only show materials, and I've actually missed a step in here too, but that's all good. Right now off screen I am Googling how to do a for loop through a table. I haven't used Touchdesigner for a little bit, so this is some good practice. Hopefully that will come on in a second. So basically what we're gonna want to do is take this opfind. The opfind will have a cell that has the path of each of these materials. We're gonna take that path, we're gonna target each of the operators in that path, and then we are going to change the operator type to pbrMAT. So in this part of the video I end up writing the script and troubleshooting a whole bunch of things, but here's a screenshot of it and we'll just walk through it one by one. So the opfind is on the top, opfind 1. And the first thing I do in my little script, and as I say, I define a variable. So the variable is named table, and it equals the operator opfind. Remember that when you're doing operators, you have to have those little quotes. So the next part is the for loop, and going from it top to bottom, the first part, for item in range, is basically going to iterate through each of the items given a range between two numbers. So in this case it's 1 and the number of rows of the opfind dat. So for each of those it's going to execute the indented code. There's 3 lines. The first one gets the path from the table's row and column defined in those brackets. The second changes the type of that operator to pbrMAT, and the third sets the parameter of the new pbrMAT, sets the parameter base color map to the moth texture, which is just beneath. This took a little bit of iteration through to figure out. I am not a great coder, so I end up adding a lot of extra code and extra lines, as you can see on the left here, but in the end it does a very simple thing. It finds all the PBRs, or finds all the phong materials, it finds their path, it uses that in an operator to use the command change type, and then it changes the base color map to moth texture. And this is great because instead of having a whole bunch of different materials pointing to their individual textures inside the FBX, it's pointing to a single texture, and now I can just change that moth texture later on and it's easy peasy. Now that I have my moth set up with its PBR textures, and again you can go into the FBX and change each phong to a PBR, but every time you refresh and make an update to the model you're going to have to do it again. Now that I've made that little script and I've tested it by refreshing and re-importing the moth, I'm now going to update the renderer. So you can see I have the render there. The moth looks kind of dull. That's kind of what PBR textures are like if they don't have a lot of lighting. And now I've just dropped in something from the palette called the arc ball camera. You can just hop into the arc ball camera, grab cam 1, copy it and paste it out of the project. And now that it's in the main scene, it's called camera 2, and I change the renderer. You'll see there I try to rotate and then zoom, and it doesn't actually work to zoom because you need to use the middle and the right mouse click. So what I'm doing is I'm going out to the project 1, which is my main panel, and I just turned on middle and right click there, right there in the top center. The sensitivity is pretty low, I don't bother to change it, but you can see now I can navigate around my my moth in an easy fashion, and it makes it a lot easier to navigate. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make this moth controllable, interactable. The idea for this was that I could open the wings and close the wings. A lot of times what you'd do is you'd make an FBX bone animation in Blender and then you would just scrub through that, but I want to have a bit more flexibility in Touchdesigner, so I bring it in here. So the first thing I did a second ago was drop down a panel chop. That panel chop is looking at the panel of the comp it's in. So it's in project 1. It's looking at the project 1 panel, and it's giving me the roll U and the roll V values. So that means where my mouse is within that panel. You can see if I move up and down, roll V increases between 0 and 1, and left to right, roll U increases between 0 and 1. So now that I have the panel set up, I'm ready to take those values and apply them in some way to my model. First I'm going to add a quick light. I'm going to add a distance light, which is like a sunlight, comes at a infinite distance. Set it to 1, and then I rotate it until I get just a little bit more detail there. Nice. Okay, so what are we doing next? Now I'm splitting my panel here, splitting my window here so that I can go inside and look at each of the different objects here. It might be a little bit hard to read because I have a 4K screen, but I've named each of my my objects inside my FBX very carefully. Left wing 1, left wing 2, legs, all that. So here I'm testing out the rotation to find out what axis that opening wing is going to be. So looks like it's the z-axis, and if I rotate it about -90 degrees, then it goes as I expect. It opens up. Here I'm getting a little bit confused because I'm moving it on the z-axis, not rotating it, but I'll figure that out in a second. And so yeah, what I want to do is I want to make it so that when I move my mouse in the panel, it rotates those wings open. So now that I know that I'm rotating the wings on the z-axis at negative degrees, I'm going to actually put this into work. So I'm going to open them up with roll V. So taking that roll V, I'm deciding to use a lookup. So I could just take the roll V and I could multiply it by a certain value, say negative 90, to get my rotation, but I like this lookup value method a bit more because I can control the easing of the animation. So the first thing I'll do is I'll create an animation comp. I change the play mode to output full range, which means instead of playing through like an animation, it's just going to give me a curve. And that curve is what I'm going to kind of scroll through using the lookup chop. So OBS didn't capture my animation window here, so I just popped it on top. But you can see what I did is I created two channels, one called wing and one called ant, which I'll use later. But the wing basically has a curve that goes between 1 and 600, and the value is between 0 and it looks like 70. And it actually doesn't matter how long it is because the 0 to 1 for the roll V is going to be scrolling through the length of this curve and selecting. So you can see as I get higher with my mouse on the roll V, it selects farther along on that curve and gives me a value of 70. You can see it right there in the lookup chop right there. So I'm going to do my due diligence. I'm going to put a null, and that null is what I'll use to export to my rotation. And right off the bat, I notice it's the wrong direction. It's rotating from 0 to 90 or 0 to 70, but I need negative 70. So I multiply it by negative 1. Now the lower wing beneath, I accidentally put it in the transform, but the lower wing is going to do something similar, but I want it to do a little bit less, to rotate not quite as much. So I multiply it by negative 0.5 instead of negative 1. Also, I play around with this value a little bit, negative 0.5, this one's actually negative 0.25. The idea being that the wing, when it opens up in its full extent of range, the inner wing doesn't open up quite as much. Here I'm now applying that same expression to the other wings, but instead of using negative values, I use positive values. And there we go. So now I find this very satisfying. It's this kind of vertical movement, and it opens the wings. And this isn't like a flying motion. It's more of a kind of getting ready for flight, I suppose. And here you can see that model is not very well developed. That's all good. So I can rotate around by clicking, and then I can open the wings by moving vertically. And great. So the second thing I'm going to do, and I'm using the edit animation window here. This time it captured it, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm increasing the value of the last keyframe so that the wings open up more. Again, it's just kind of a nice flexible aspect of using this lookup method. I'm adjusting the bottom wing a little bit so that it opens a little bit less, a little bit more, a little bit less, just tweaking values here. It looks alright. It's not the best, but this is more of a proof of concept anyway. Changing the value so it's mirrored on the other side. I'm also noticing that the wings aren't closing entirely, so I'm looking at my animation editor, and what I'll do soon is I'm popping out a floating copy here, and oh no, there we go. Just using that little window as an animation editor. Here I'm adjusting the first frame, and it starts at a value of 20 for some reason. I don't know how that happened. So I'm changing the value to 0, like that. I accidentally changed both the values. There we go. So yeah, that's why I like to use lookup. It's flexible. It's kind of like a remap. It's a remap that ramps differently in a way. Yeah, I like that. The model doesn't look fantastic to me, but I like the motion. It feels very satisfying to control. So, just to be clear, the reason this is working is because the pivot point of those wings are set right there on the shoulders, those little balls on the shoulders. That would not work if it was not set up that way. So make sure that you set up all your pivot points correctly. Now I'm making a second kind of stream here. I'm using roll U, which is the horizontal movement, and I'm going to use that to move the antennas. So I'm creating a second channel of animation here. I'm going to call it ant, and I'm going to do the same thing as the wings, except I'm going to move the antennas left and right. I'm thinking that I want to do it about 20 degrees. That's what I have in mind. So I just connected, as you can see on the top, connected the roll U to the lookup. I'm finding my antennas, right ant. I'm checking out the values. It's rotating on the Z axis. I'm seeing generally how much it wants to rotate. And now I'm going to take those two keyframes, it puts them 0, 0, and the first frame and 600 frame, and I'm just setting it to 20. So now the ramp is between 0 and 20. Doing my due diligence, making a null. Always do that so you can add stuff beforehand. And I'm connecting the ant. And right off the bat I can see that it's negative. It's inverted, so I add a -1. I copy that expression to the other. I kind of like that, I like the antenna movement, but it's not what I end up on. So you'll notice that the antennas are pointing to the right, but they're not pointing to the left. That's because the keyframes are between 0 and 20. What I need to do is set it to -20, 20. Again, it's just this, it's just, there we go. So we've got all the motion that we want, and the video could stop there, but there's still one more thing that's bugging me, and that is that while we can update this Moth model and the PBR textures will be updated, what we'll find out in a second is that as soon as I re-import this model, it's going to completely wipe all of the Moth animation. So look at that, it's kind of cool. I'm thinking about other ways I want to add interactivity. Maybe the body could roll a little bit. Maybe I would love to be able to make the Moth kind of walk across the ground. That will be a whole different video for sure. Okay, so at this point here, I know something's up. I know that if I were to refresh this, it's probably going to kill all my animation. So how are we going to solve that? I'm going to pop out. I'm going to find my Moth FBX. I'm going to re-import. You can see the materials turn to phong. I run my little script by hitting Control R, and all my animation's gone, all that hard work I put into. And this is why I don't like using FBXs, and this is why you have to write little scripts to kind of manage them. So what we're going to do is, instead of doing an expression link like we did in that section just before, we're going to use a chop execute to shoot the values from that little null there to the geometry directly. And I like this method because it only updates every frame that you have a new value coming through your chop, so it's a bit more efficient, and also because it's it doesn't break. So what I'm doing right now is and I hope you can see that, is I'm writing if channel equals ant, then print the value that's coming through. And this doesn't work right off the bat because you actually need to do if channel name equals ant. So here I go. I'll say if channel dot name equals ant, send the value, and there's the value. So what are we going to do with that value? Well, we want to shoot that to those Moth wings just as we did before. But first I need to reference those Moth wings. So I'm going to create a variable, a whole bunch of variables: left antenna, right antenna, left wing 1, left wing 2, R wing 1, our wing 2. And I'm pointing that to the operator. I add those little quotes there. And now what I'll do is I'll drag the operator from my FBX directly into my chop execute to get the path. So drag that up there. Boom. And you can see I'll have to reposition those quotes, probably because my cursor was not in the right location. And now that I have the left antenna, I'm just going to copy this and do left antenna, right antenna. I debate if I'm going to drop it again. I think I end up doing it. Could have probably just typed that. Here we go. Left wing 1. Delete extra space. Left wing 2. And we don't have much time left. We're almost done. Right wing 1. Right wing 2. Okay, so now that we have the value coming through, channel name, we're going to say, okay, that variable we just created, left antenna, let's take the parameter RZ, which is the Z rotation, and let's make it equal the value that's coming through. And so only the value of the ant channel is coming through. I multiply it by -1, and then I will change it to rant. You can see it's very similar to our previous process, it's just this time it's in code. And it's kind of fun to do those two things because you kind of understand how where the code comes from a little bit. So I've duplicated it because I have a whole another set of lookup table here. Probably could have been done better. And I say this time if the channel is wing, if that's changing, then why don't you change the L wing 1 rotation Z to the value times -1, and then I will copy that line and do it for the rest. So do L wing 2 times -0.4, I think, 0.5. The one thing that I'm not very satisfied about in this setup is that I have to have negative values on one side and positive values on another. I would like to have it kind of automatically know that. I think the shorter you make your code, the better, of course. So R wing 1, you can see they're rotating the same direction. This is exactly what I'm talking about, is that I prefer them be going the same direction. So there I remove the multiply instead of the negative. It confuses me for a second, but I will figure it out in just a second here. There we go. It should be times, not time. Yeah, there we go. Times 1 and times 0.4. There we go. So that's great. So now we're like just beaming those values straight to those pieces of geometry. I can re-import, the animation still works, and then I can run my little script and I can get the PBR animation again. There we go. So this is basically just setting up the scene so that we can work with FBXs and we can create animation and we can modify things and modify the model, and it's not going to cause problems. So I like this because I'm going to update that Moth model. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to improve a lot of aspects of it, and I don't want to have to go back and redo the PBR materials all the time. Here I want it to look a bit better, so I bring in an HDR and plug it into the environment. It doesn't actually make that big of a difference, partially because the PBR settings for each of those materials is kinda rough. It doesn't have a lot of shininess, so it's not picking up a lot of the color. There's lots of things we can do to make that better. And yeah, there we go. That's the final outcome. So in the next tutorial, what I'll probably end up doing is I will definitely improve the render quality. It looks very much like a 90s video game render. There's a bunch we could do about that. We can add depth of field. We can add ambient occlusion, which I don't use very often. We can add things like bloom. There's a bunch of stuff that you can do to get you closer to photorealism. And here I'm just I'm messing with the render size. I'm working on a 4K screen, so I want to see this thing rendered 4K. That pretty much wraps it up. So this tutorial was made in about 45 minutes, and then I went through and I edited it in about another 45 minutes. It's pretty rough, but if it's useful, I'll continue doing these things, and if not, I won't. Thank you for listening, and catch you later.